The year 1942 was a dark and desperate time for the Allied cause. In the East, the Soviet Union strained under the colossal weight of the German war machine, its armies reeling, its cities besieged. Joseph Stalin, with increasing urgency, demanded the opening of a second front in Western Europe, a brutal calculus of shared sacrifice to bleed the German army on two fronts instead of one. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army had been pushed back to the borders of Egypt, its back against the wall. In the Atlantic, the U-boat menace threatened to sever the vital lifeline of supplies from North America to Great Britain. The United States, having entered the war only months before, was still mobilizing its immense industrial and military might, eager to take the fight to Germany, but not yet fully prepared for a continental invasion. Within Britain itself, a different kind of pressure was building. Years of defensive posture, of waiting since the evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940, had bred a potent mix of frustration and impatience. This was felt most acutely within the ranks of the 1st Canadian Army. For nearly 3 years, its soldiers had trained in the green fields of England, honing their skills, waiting for the call to action that never seemed to come. Public and political pressure was mounting in Canada to get its troops into the fight, to prove their mettle as their fathers had done in the Great War. It was in this cauldron of strategic necessity, political pressure, and martial impatience that the idea for a major raid on the French coast was born. It would not be an invasion, not the opening of the long-awaited Second Front, but something more than the small-scale commando pinprick raids that had been conducted thus far. The concept originated within the Combined Operations Headquarters, a dynamic organization led by the ambitious and royally connected Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. His mandate was to devise the techniques, equipment, and strategies for amphibious warfare, for landing on an enemy-held coast, a skill the Allies desperately needed to master if they were ever to return to the continent. The plan, initially codenamed Operation Jubilee, was audacious. A division-sized force would assault the German-occupied port of Dieppe, seize it, hold it for the duration of 2 tides, destroy port facilities and German defenses, gather vital intelligence, and then withdraw. Dieppe, a resort town on the English Channel, was chosen partly because it was within range of RAF fighter cover from Britain. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General John Hamilton "Ham" Roberts, was chosen for the main assault force, a decision eagerly accepted by Canadian High Command. By May 1942, the division was on the Isle of Wight, undergoing intensive training for the amphibious assault. The plan was complex, involving flanking attacks by British commandos to neutralize heavy gun batteries, parachute drops inland, and a main frontal assault on the town of Dieppe itself, supported by a new regiment of Churchill tanks. However, Operation Jubilee was plagued by misfortune. Poor weather in early July forced repeated postponements. Then, German bombers attacked the assembly ports, damaging 2 of the troop ships. Worse, security had grown lax. With over 10,000 men briefed on the operation, the secret was out, and it was feared the Germans would be alerted. Reluctantly, in early July, the operation was cancelled. The troops returned to their bases, dejected. Many senior commanders, including General Bernard Montgomery, who had been involved in the initial planning, believed the moment had passed and that to remount the same attack against the same target would be folly. But the pressures that had created Jubilee had not dissipated. They had only intensified. Mountbatten, his prestige on the line, lobbied hard to revive the raid. He and the Canadian commanders, particularly Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, argued that morale was low and that the valuable training would be wasted. In a move that would later be scrutinized with bitter hindsight, they decided to proceed. They banked on the audacious assumption that the Germans would never believe the Allies would be so foolish as to attack the very same target just a month later. The plan was hastily revived under a new code name, Operation Jubilee. It was essentially the same plan as Rutter, but with crucial and ultimately fatal alterations. The preliminary airborne drops were cancelled due to the risks of a night operation, and a planned heavy bombing of the town's defences was also scrapped, largely out of concern for causing casualties among the French civilian population. The success of the raid would now depend almost entirely on achieving complete surprise and on the speed and aggression of the ground troops. Fire support would be limited to the guns of the naval destroyers offshore and a continuous air umbrella from the Royal Air Force, which hoped to lure the Luftwaffe into a major battle of attrition. The force was formidable. The corps consisted of 4,963 soldiers of the 2nd Canadian Division. They were supplemented by over 1,000 British commandos, a small contingent of 50 elite U.S. Army Rangers dispersed among the commando units to gain combat experience, and 15 Free French soldiers. This ground force of over 6,000 men would be transported and supported by a naval force of 237 ships and landing craft, including 8 destroyers, commanded by Captain John Hughes Hallett. The air component, under Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lair Mallory, comprised 74 squadrons of fighters and bombers. Major General Roberts, the ground commander, would direct the battle from the destroyer HMS Calper offshore, a floating headquarters that would prove to be tragically disconnected from the reality on the beaches. The plan was a complex symphony of synchronized landings across a 16-kilometer front, centered on Dieppe. It was to begin in the pre-dawn darkness of August 19th, 1942. On the far eastern flank, at a beach codenamed Yellow, No. 3 Commando would land to silence the Goebbels coastal battery at Berneval. On the far western flank, at Orange Beach, No. 4 Commando, with its American Rangers, had the task of neutralizing the Hesse battery near Varengeville. These commando landings were critical. Success there would prevent the heavy German guns from enfilading the main landing beaches. Closer to Dieppe, 2 more flanking attacks were planned. To the east of the town, at a narrow, cliff-flanked beach called Puy, Blue Beach, the Royal Regiment of Canada, reinforced by platoons from the Black Watch of Canada, would land. Their objective was to fight their way up the cliffs, secure the eastern headland overlooking Dieppe's main beach, and neutralize machine gun and artillery positions there. To the west, at Pourville, Green Beach, the South Saskatchewan Regiment would land, followed by the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada. Their mission was to secure the western headland and push inland towards a German airfield. Only after these flanking attacks were underway would the main assault begin, 30 minutes later, directly on the promenade of Dieppe itself. The beach was divided into 2 sectors, Red Beach to the east and White Beach to the west. The Essex Scottish Regiment was assigned to Red Beach, while the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry would land on White Beach, directly in front of a large fortified casino. These 2 battalions would bear the brunt of the frontal assault, tasked with fighting their way into the town. Supporting them would be the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, the Calgary Regiment, who would land their 27 Churchill tanks on the main beaches to provide heavy firepower and break through the German defences. Held in floating reserve were Les Fusiliers, Mont-Royal, and a unit of Royal Marines, to be committed wherever they were most needed. The plan was a masterpiece of staff work on paper, a complex web of timings and objectives. But it was a fragile plan, utterly dependent on a chain of assumptions. That surprise would be maintained, that darkness would shield the initial landings, that naval and air bombardment would be sufficient to suppress the defenders, and that the German defences were not as formidable as they appeared. In the dark, early hours of August 19th, 1942, as the vast armada slipped silently away from English ports and into the calm, moonless waters of the Channel, none of the thousands of young men aboard could know that every single one of those assumptions was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. For many, it was the culmination of years of waiting, the chance to finally prove themselves. It would instead become, for a horrifying number of them, their first and last day of the war. The crossing was unnervingly quiet, the dark shapes of the ships cutting through the black water. On board, men made their final checks, a quiet tension hanging in the air. For the soldiers of the 2nd Canadian Division, this was the moment they had yearned for. But as the easternmost flotilla, carrying No. 3 Commando towards Yellow Beach, neared the French coast, disaster struck. At 3:47 a.m., lookouts spotted the dark silhouettes of ships. It was a small German coastal convoy, steaming out of Boulogne. In the darkness, chaos erupted as tracers tore across the water. A short, vicious firefight ensued between the British escort gunboats and the German vessels. The sharp crack of naval guns and the rattle of machine guns shattered the night silence, and with it, any hope of surprise on the eastern flank. The German shore batteries were alerted. The meticulously planned surprise, the cornerstone of Operation Jubilee, had crumbled before the first boot touched French soil. The naval engagement scattered the landing craft of No. 3 Commando. Only a handful of boats, carrying just 18 commandos, managed to land near their objective, the Goebbels battery at Berneval. With impossible odds, this tiny force, armed with rifles and grenades, could not launch a full assault. Instead, they took up positions and began sniping at the gun crews with such precision and ferocity that they managed to distract the artillerymen for a crucial period, preventing the guns from firing accurately on the main fleet for an hour and a half. It was an act of incredible bravery, but their primary mission had failed. The heavy guns at Berneval remained a potent threat. The other commando units were largely taken prisoner after being overwhelmed by German forces that had been alerted by the skirmish at sea. Meanwhile, on the far western flank, fortune smiled, if only for a moment. At Orange Beach, Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovett's No. 4 Commando, which included the 50 U.S. Rangers, landed at 4:50 a.m. Their approach had been undetected. The commandos scaled the steep cliffs, split into two groups to attack the Hesse battery at Varengeville from the flank and rear. They achieved complete surprise, overran the position in a swift and professional assault, and destroyed the 6 150 mm guns with explosives. By 7:30 a.m., their mission accomplished, they withdrew as planned and re-embarked, having suffered minimal casualties. It was a textbook commando operation and would stand as the only unqualified success of the entire Dieppe Raid. But between these two extremes of failure and success, in the center of the assault, a catastrophe was unfolding. The landings at Puys on Blue Beach were scheduled for 4:50 a.m. Here, the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Black Watch platoons were tasked with seizing the formidable eastern headland that dominated the main Dieppe beach. Due to navigational errors and the confusion from the sea battle, their landing craft were delayed. They approached the shore not in darkness, but in the grey, growing light of dawn. The alerted German defenders from the 302nd Infantry Division were waiting for them, nestled in concrete pillboxes and trenches carved into the cliff face. As the landing craft lowered their ramps some 10 meters from the shore, the Germans opened fire with a storm of machine gun and mortar rounds. The Canadians were slaughtered as they waded through the water and tried to cross the narrow strip of beach. They were caught in a perfectly prepared kill zone, trapped between the churning sea and a high, wire-topped seawall. A few small groups made it to the seawall, but they were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Within an hour, the attack had completely disintegrated. Communication broke down. The few who survived the initial onslaught were killed or captured. Evacuation was impossible under the hail of fire. The Royal Regiment of Canada was virtually annihilated, suffering the heaviest losses of any Canadian battalion in a single day of the entire war. The failure to secure the eastern headland was a critical blow. Its guns now had a clear, enfilading field of fire across the main beaches of Dieppe, where the primary assault was about to begin. Slightly to the west of Dieppe, at Pourville on Green Beach, the landings of the South Saskatchewan Regiment at 4:52 a.m. initially went much better. They achieved a degree of surprise and got ashore with light casualties, crossing the River Sai and pushing into the small village. However, German resistance quickly stiffened. As they advanced towards their objectives, the high ground and the airfield inland, they were met with increasingly heavy and accurate fire. The Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada landed behind them and pushed inland as well, with one group advancing nearly 3 kilometers before being stopped cold. Without tank support, which was supposed to come from the main beaches, and facing well-sighted German positions, their advance stalled. Soon the order came to withdraw. The evacuation from Pourville became a desperate, costly fight. The Germans, now occupying the high ground to the east and west, poured a merciless fire down onto the beach as the landing craft came in. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewans earned the Victoria Cross for his incredible bravery, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to direct his men and organize a rear guard that allowed many to escape, though he himself was captured. While some were rescued, hundreds more were killed, wounded, or left behind to be taken prisoner. At 5:20 a.m., 30 minutes after the disastrous flank attacks began, the main frontal assault on Dieppe's red and white beaches commenced. As 4 destroyers shelled the coastline and RAF Hurricanes swept in to bomb defences and lay a smoke screen, the landing craft carrying the Essex Scottish and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry churned towards the shore. The smokescreen, intended to shield them, was blown away by an offshore breeze, leaving the men horribly exposed on the wide, open promenade. From the heights of the unconquered eastern headland, from the fortified western headland, and from hotels and houses along the waterfront that had been turned into concrete blockhouses, the German machine guns opened up. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar. The landing craft were shredded before they even touched the shore. The men who made it onto the beach were met with a wall of lead. The beach itself was a death trap. It was not sand, but a deep bank of large, loose chert pebbles, a geological feature for which the region is known. The men, laden with equipment, sank into the shifting stones, their progress agonizingly slow. The beach offered no cover. Soldiers were cut down in rows as they struggled across the killing ground. Those who reached the dubious safety of the high seawall were pinned, unable to advance into the town through the tangled barbed wire and concrete obstacles that had been left intact by the lack of heavy bombardment. At 5:35 a.m., the tanks of the Calgary Regiment began to land. Their arrival was meant to be the decisive blow, the armoured fist that would punch through the defences. Instead, it became another facet of the disaster. The chert pebbles that bogged down the infantry proved even more destructive to the Churchill tanks. Several were disabled in the surf. Others threw their tracks as the sharp stones became wedged in their running gear. Of the 27 tanks that were landed, only 15 managed to crawl over the seawall and onto the promenade. But once there, they found their paths into the town blocked by massive concrete barriers. Immobilized, they became static pillboxes, their crews fighting bravely, but ineffectively, until their ammunition was spent or they were knocked out by German anti-tank guns. Their smoking, broken hulks added to the carnage on the beach, providing scant cover for the desperate infantry. Aboard HMS Calpe, several miles offshore, Major General Roberts and Captain Hughes Hallett struggled to understand the chaos. Radio communications were poor, and the messages that did get through were confused and contradictory. A misleading message suggested that the Essex Scottish were in the town and making good progress. Based on this tragically flawed information, Roberts committed his floating reserve, Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal, at 7 a.m. They were sent into the same inferno on Red Beach, their arrival only adding more targets for the German gunners and increasing the chaos and casualties. Small pockets of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry did manage to breach the seawall near the casino on White Beach and engage in vicious street fighting in the town, but they were too few and without support. Overhead, a furious air battle was raging, the largest of the war to date. 74 Allied squadrons clashed with the Luftwaffe. The RAF fighters, primarily Spitfires and Hurricanes, succeeded in their primary mission of protecting the naval force from significant air attack, but it came at a staggering cost. The Allied air forces lost 106 aircraft, the highest single-day loss of the entire war. The Luftwaffe lost 48. The sky over Dieppe was a maelstrom of dogfights, smoke, and falling planes. By 9 a.m., the reality of the situation on the beaches could no longer be denied, even in the detached environment of the command ship. The attack had failed everywhere except for the commando raid at Varengeville. The flanking attacks at Puy and Pourville had been shattered, and the main assault on Dieppe was a bloody stalemate, with thousands of men trapped on the beaches. At 11 a.m., the agonizing decision was made. Hughes, Hallett, and Roberts gave the order to withdraw. The evacuation was even more horrific than the landing. The landing craft, many already damaged, had to nose back into the beaches under the same unrelenting fire. The Royal Navy crews displayed immense bravery, pushing their craft onto the shore to take on the exhausted, wounded, and terrified survivors. Smoke screens were laid again, but the German gunners, now with the range perfectly dialed in, fired blindly into the haze. Landing craft laden with men were hit and exploded. Others were sunk as they tried to pull away from the shore. Jack McFarland, a soldier with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, watched as a German bomber strafed men swimming in the water. Many soldiers were cut down as they tried to wade out to the boats. The tide was rising, covering the dead and dying on the shingle. By 12:20 p.m., it was no longer possible to reach the main beach. The last boats pulled away, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Burning tanks, wrecked landing craft, and the bodies of thousands of men lying on the blood-soaked pebbles. Left in a hopeless situation, the senior officers on the beach made the decision to surrender. White flags began to appear among the carnage. The Dieppe Raid was over. The return journey to England was a somber procession of shattered ships and shattered men. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who had set out with such high hopes the evening before, 3,367 had become casualties. More than 900 were dead, and another 1,946 were taken as prisoners of war, many of them wounded. This represented a casualty rate of 68%. The number of Canadian prisoners taken at Dieppe was greater than the total for the entire 11-month campaign in northwest Europe 2 years later. The British commandos suffered 247 casualties. The Royal Navy lost a destroyer and 33 landing craft, along with 550 sailors killed and wounded. The 50 U.S. Rangers lost 3 killed, 5 wounded, and 3 captured. German casualties, by contrast, were light, 591 in total. In the immediate aftermath, there was bewilderment and a search for answers. Propaganda tried to spin the raid as a qualified success, a reconnaissance in force that had achieved its objectives. But for the men who survived, and the nation of Canada, which bore the brunt of the losses, it was an unmitigated disaster, a colossal blunder. The causes of the failure were many and interconnected. The loss of surprise was critical. The lack of adequate fire support, especially the cancellation of the heavy bomber attack, was catastrophic. The plan itself was too complex, too rigid, and based on tragically poor intelligence about the strength of the German defenses and the nature of the beaches. The command and control system, with the force commander isolated on a ship miles from the battle, had completely broken down. Yet, from the ashes of this terrible defeat, crucial lessons were learned, lessons paid for in blood on the beaches of Dieppe. The debate over whether the sacrifice was necessary would continue for decades, but the raid's influence on future Allied operations is undeniable. Planners now understood with brutal clarity that a frontal assault on a heavily defended port was suicidal. The idea of capturing a major harbor intact was abandoned. This led directly to the development of the Mulberry harbors, the incredible artificial ports that would be towed across the channel to support the D-Day landings. Dieppe demonstrated the absolute necessity of overwhelming fire support. Future amphibious assaults would be preceded by massive, sustained naval and aerial bombardments designed not just to suppress, but to obliterate coastal defenses. The disaster with the tanks on the Chert Beach highlighted the need for specialized armored vehicles, leading to the development of Hobart's funnies for D-Day tanks designed to clear mines, bridge gaps, and overcome beach obstacles. The importance of detailed intelligence, combined operations, and effective communication between land, sea, and air forces was seared into the minds of Allied strategists. Lord Mountbatten himself would later claim, "I have no doubt that the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe. For every man who died at Dieppe," he argued, 10 were saved on D-Day. It is a cold and controversial justification for such a devastating loss of life. For the survivors, the prisoners who endured years of harsh captivity, and the families of the fallen, the legacy of Dieppe was one of profound and personal tragedy. It was a dark day in Canadian history, a sacrifice on a scale that shook the nation. The raid was a tactical failure of immense proportions, but from its harsh and bitter lessons, the foundations of the eventual victory in Europe were laid. The names of the Essex Scottish, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Royal Regiment of Canada, and all who fought and fell are forever etched into the pebbles of that French beach, a testament to their courage and a grim, enduring symbol of the terrible price of knowledge.